He is considered by many to be one of the strongest and certainly most popular presidents in recent times.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Former President Ronald Reagan would have hit a major milestone this year, turning 100 years old.
Joining us live, President Reagan's son, Ron Reagan, to talk about his father, his legacy, and reports that he may have shown signs of Alzheimer's disease during his presidency. I think that surprised a lot of people, Ron Reagan, since there were a lot of doctors at the time who said that those signs of Alzheimer's didn't show up until after he left office.
Mm-hmm. That's what I say in the book, largely, as well. I think we have to distinguish between Alzheimer's, the disease, and dementia, which is a symptom of Alzheimer's that shows up in its later stages, generally speaking. What we now know about Alzheimer's, didn't know back then, but know now, is that it is a process that unfolds over years, even decades, before actual symptoms arise. Now, given that, and given when my father was diagnosed after he left office, the question of whether the disease was present when he was president is really an academic one. It is virtual certainty. However, I say specifically in the book that I saw no dementia-like symptoms at the time, and I also mentioned that neither my father nor anybody else that I'm aware of had any inkling that he had Alzheimer's while he was in office. In retrospect, I can look back and say that some little moments that I experienced while he was president, I've likened it to watching a TV and the picture, briefly goes out of focus and then snaps back in. And you say, well, what did I just see? In retrospect, perhaps those things were very early signs of Alzheimer's, but they could have been something else, too. I mean, people have a bad day. He was moving into his mid-70s at that point, and he'd been shot and nearly killed, early in his presidency, which will take a little of the wind out of your sails. So I wanted to deal with this as honestly and as straightforwardly as I could, so I included all of this in the book, although I'd hate for people to have the impression that the book is about him having Alzheimer's in office. That is a very small part of the book.
Yeah, and on the heel of all of this, Ron, your half-brother Michael is saying that this is all about falsehoods and conspiracy theories to sell your book.
Well, it's somewhat ironic because I think Mike is doing all he can to sell more copies of my book for me. I didn't quite anticipate that, and I don't think that was his intention. He's also said some unfortunate things about me being an embarrassment to the family, which don't actually hold water. I don't really worry about what my brother says, though, and I don't engage in intrafamilial squabbles in public. I just don't think that's a good policy.
Back to your dad, he always seemed like a what you see is what you get kind of man, to me anyway. Was that the case, or was there another side of your dad we did not see?
Yes, there was, and I speak about it in a metaphorical sense in the book in terms of the 90% that was the public man who everybody saw, and you're absolutely right. What you saw was what you got, and he was very much the same at home. There wasn't a big difference between his public persona and his private persona, but there was also a metaphorical 10% that he let very few people see, even people who were closest to him, even his wife and his children. You would just get glimpses of this kind of inner core that was his solitary self, where he kept his ambition and his inner thoughts. And this was something that developed, I think, in his very early life, because as a little boy, and he was a little boy, we think of him as a big, kind of impressive guy, but as a youngster, he was undersized, and he was often picked on by bullies, chosen last for games in the schoolyard, and the family moved around, so he was often the new kid in school, and he ended up spending a lot of time by himself and in his own head, and imagining, I think, his life in the future and creating a kind of personal narrative. My father came from a long line of storytellers, I think, and was a storyteller himself, but his greatest opus, I think, was himself.
I think everybody knows that you probably hang a little left of center, and that your father certainly was to the right of the center line.
Right.
You had to have been affected, though, by the tremendous criticism from the left of your father while he was in office. How did you feel about that at the time?
Well, people are, of course, entitled to their political views, and political criticism is all fair game. I would object and feel bad when it became personal and when the attacks became personal, because as much as I might have disagreed with my father about this or that political issue, I always knew him as a good man who was trying to do his best for the country. He only thought that he was doing things that would be helpful. He was quite sincere in that. There was no guile in him. There was no cynicism in my father. It made him kind of strange in a way. He was so devoid of cynicism and guile. But that was the case, and I never doubted for a moment that he was a good man doing his best.
Special man to so many people, and we thank you so much for sharing your time with us to talk more about him. Ron Reagan there, president of Ronald Reagan, his book, My Father at 100. By the way, we'll be talking with Michael Reagan tomorrow morning right here on KTRH. He, too, as Ron mentioned, has a book out. It's on the anniversary of his father's 100th birthday. It's called The New Reagan Revolution.